Welcome back to Up Close. We're talking this morning with two of the candidates for Staten Island District Attorney. They're Republican Dan Donovan and Democrat Michael Ryan. And joining me to ask the questions of the candidates is Tom Robleski, and he is the political editor for the Staten Island Advance. And Tom, I'll let you start with this question here.
Occupy Wall Street's what a lot of people are talking about. Hundreds of arrests. Protesters are demanding to have their own individual trials. I mean, how would you deal with it if this was Staten Island and we had these hundreds of cases coming through?
I mean, everybody has their right to their day in court. My understanding is that many of them were offered a disposition at arraignment. Some took it, some didn't. There are some outstanding warrants now because some people didn't appear. Everybody has their day in court. You have to use the resources you have to prosecute the cases that are before you. Some cases we investigate and cause the arrest ourselves. But most of the cases that the district attorney's office deals with in all 5 boroughs are cases that are brought in by the police department. So if the police department brings you 900 cases, you have to deal with them.
Mr. Ryan?
You know, I know why this keeps coming up. I still believe that the primary issues are guns and drugs and burglaries going on in Staten Island, not the Occupy Wall Street issue. I don't believe that that's going to touch our borough quite in the way that it's touching Manhattan. However, you have to deal with the cases, as Mr. Donovan says, you got to deal with the cases that come your way. There's been other instances where there's been protests on Staten Island, and depending upon the individual actions of the protesters, that will determine the outcome. If they get violent with the police, clearly that's not something that we can sanction. If they're peaceful protesters and they surrender peaceably and are simply, public protesters, nonviolent, then you deal with them differently.
Okay, when you talk about drugs and violence on the streets of Staten Island, let's talk a little bit, because I know one of your big issues has been this prescription drug issue. Why do you think that's such a big problem on Staten Island, and what could be done better by your opponent here?
It's a big problem on Staten Island because we're the leading county in the state in prescription drug overdose. 7.4 out of every 100,000 Staten Islanders dies from prescription drug overdose. What can be different is targeted enforcement, particularly of the doctors that may be running pill mills out of their office. I believe that would be a small percentage of the doctors, but a dangerous percentage of the doctors. And the other thing is that there has been no public education program to replace the defunded DARE program, and we need to get that information into the schools and the PTAs.
I mean, this issue has been a big one for your opponent here, Mr. Ryan. What do you say, Mr. Donovan, about,
We've done,
drug abuse?
yeah, it's a national epidemic. Last year, for the first time ever, deaths of overdose from prescription drugs outpaced car accident deaths. We did have 28 deaths on Staten Island that are attributed to prescription drug overdose, but this is a national epidemic. In the last 2 years, we've taken down 4 organizations for selling prescription drugs. I've prosecuted over 100 people for selling prescription drugs. One of those people actually was my opponent's client, who 2 weeks ago we prosecuted, we put in jail, and we had him forfeit $14,000 from his illicit sales. So we've done a wonderful job, but it's a national epidemic, and I propose a draft of legislation that we have a congressman now carrying from Staten Island down in Washington to have a national database so that people can't go doctor shopping or pharmacy shopping.
Do you think he's doing a good job?
I absolutely do not, and he keeps bringing up the fact that I've represented an individual, which I think is not only unfair to me, it's unfair to the voters of Staten Island, it's unfair to the individual who took responsibility for his actions. But it still begs the question, what's Dan Donovan been doing for the last 4 years when I said it was a burgeoning problem 4 years ago? I warned him on election night when he won last time. I said, Dan, do a good job for the people of Staten Island. Make sure you eradicate these drugs. And 4 years ago, it was a problem. And now it's an epidemic. I don't care if it's a national epidemic. I care if it's an epidemic on Staten Island. It's his job to root out the epidemic on Staten Island, and he hasn't done it. And he ought to stop criticizing me for representing people when it's his office that offers the plea bargains, not mine.
Well, I'm not,
response there?
yeah, I'm not criticizing. You can't have the hypocrisy of saying that there's a prescription drug problem and take drug dealers' money. You can't make that your issue. I don't begrudge Michael for. I need to.
Okay.
I don't need to begrudge him for representing somebody. He's a criminal defense attorney. That's what they do. But you can't say that it's a drug problem and then take drug dealers' money and defend them in court. Okay?
On that particular issue, I spoke to the defendant's mom, actually paid my fee. This guy is a sad guy that developed a drug problem. Dan has labeled him a drug dealer. father. He was never charged with drug dealing. He had some quantity of narcotics on him, but his family, his father who emigrated from Greece, who was a hardworking man, paid my legal fee and paid the restitution. It didn't come from the defendant. He didn't have a penny with the guy to his name because he ravaged his life with drugs. That's a tragedy. We did what we could do to help him. That's what lawyers do. That's what Dan doesn't understand because he hasn't been a lawyer for 20 years.
Okay, we want to move on to another topic.
Also, speaking of 4 years ago, your opponent had the conservative endorsement in the race, endorsed by the conservatives in the past in other races. You sure you're the conservative candidate when people in Staten Island ask you, what are your conservative credentials? What do you tell them?
I tell them that I'm a married father of 3, that I share many of the views of the Conservative Party, not the least of which is fiscal restraint. Since I pay taxes, I want my tax money spent wisely. And I think yesterday we saw an example of perhaps why Dan didn't get the Conservative Party endorsement when he referred to statutory rape as consummation of love between a 19-year-old and a 14-year-old. That certainly doesn't sound like a conservative ideal to me, referring to crime of rape as love.
I'm sure you want to respond to that, Mr. Donovan.
Yeah, mischaracterizing. I did explain to the audience yesterday what statutory rape is. We have very little stranger-on-stranger crime in Staten Island. People don't have to be fearful walking out on streets. One reason for that is what we've done over the last 8 years. We don't have women who have to be afraid of being dragged off our street and raped. Most of our rapes are between 2 people who know one another, and many of them are because of a man who's over age and a child who's too young to give her consent have sex. This is so rampant that some of our high schools had me come and speak to some of the boys and say, yes, you can date her. Yes, you could go out with her. You could hold her in your hand, but you can't have sex with her because that's a crime. These are crimes that are happening where the young girl doesn't realize it's a crime and the young man doesn't realize it's a crime. But because of her age, she's unable to consent under all laws and end up having 19-year-olds arrested for statutory rape. But the point that I was making was that people on Staten Island are more likely to be harmed by somebody they know than somebody they don't know. Of our 17 homicides last year, 7 of them were domestic violence homicides. That's why I've made domestic violence the cornerstone of my campaign, and it's been the cornerstone of my administration for the last 4 years. You are more likely on Staten Island to be harmed by somebody you know than somebody you don't know.
You ran unsuccessfully for Attorney General last year. To voters re-elect you as District Attorney, will you pledge that you're done running for higher office?
I am finished, Tom. I had a wonderful experience last year visiting our entire state. It's a beautiful state. But once was enough for me. And other than the result, I don't regret anything. And I think the people of Staten Island really wanted to see me succeed last year. I got 65% of the vote in the Attorney General's race from people of Staten Island.
Okay. To be fair,
I think the people of Staten Island should be troubled. Not just by the fact that Dan ran, but by the fact that he started to run back in 2005 when he formed his first campaign committee. And what's more troubling, when you talk about potentially people being beholden to someone else, he owes $283,000 from his failed Attorney General's race, with no apparent plan on how to pay that off. Yet he went ahead and formed another campaign committee to raise money to run for re-election as District Attorney. That troubles me as a voter, and I think it's going to trouble a lot of the voters on Staten Island.
Is it illegal to do that?
It's certainly not illegal. However, you would prosecute somebody who incurred a debt with no intention of paying it off. And yet we find our current district attorney in a position of having his campaign committee owe $283,000 with no apparent plan on how that money is going to get paid.
you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I don't tell Mike any of my plans, for one. And secondly, Mayor Dinkins just paid off his campaign debt from his 1993 election. And I guess probably to Mike there was no apparent plan then for Mayor Dinkins to pay off his debt. I intend to pay off my debt, Diana, but it has nothing to do with who's the better candidate for Staten Island. You have your choice between somebody with 16 years experience as a prosecutor and somebody who's never prosecuted a case in their life.
Very quickly, because we're almost out of time. What's special to you about Staten Island? That's the same with you, Mr. Ryan?
You know, my opponent's been talking about comparing Staten Island to other cities throughout the country in terms of crime rate. I want to restore Staten Island back to the Staten Island that I grew up in. You know, I'm a lifelong Staten Islander. I know that we can't hit the rewind button of life and go back to the way things used to be. But certainly, the Staten Island that I grew up in, where they were trapping muskrats across the street from my house, and the sprayer would come and spray for mosquitoes, in the summertime. That was the beautiful Staten Island that I grew up in, and I want my children to have that same feeling of experience, even if we can't go back to the less populated times.
I think Staten Island's the most ideal place to live. We have the benefits of being part of the greatest city in the world, New York City. We have New York City Police Department protecting us, the fire department protecting us. At the same time, we're more of a community than other parts of our city. 70% of our people are homeowners, and they take their kids to school. They have the same concerns about everybody else, but it's more of a community. It's more of a suburban area, so we have the benefits of having a great living environment at the same time being part of the greatest city in New York.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. This flew by. I hope we get a lot more in. So we'll be chatting in a moment, so stay with us, Tom, and I'll be right back after this.